Hi everyone, welcome back to Healthy with Nicole. And if you're new to my channel, I am Nicole Carter. I'm a health educator and health coach, and I focus a lot on gut health because that has been my history, and I've lived through all kinds of things with gut health, especially healing it. And so I want to share with you some things in my journey with ulcerative colitis that might be applicable to you, especially if you are in a flare or you have flares from a autoimmune disease. And they don't have to be necessarily for ulcerative colitis, but really any flare, a flare up, if you will, of your autoimmunity. So what is a flare? Basically, for gut health, and when we're talking about colitis or Crohn's, a lot of times people will have different versions of a flare. For me, when I used to get a flare up, I would feel nauseous, my bloating would get more intense, and sometimes I would sport a fever. And really just have like a bad feeling day. Some people, it gets much, much worse. Some people need to be hospitalized from a flare up. So there's a range of severity when we're talking about flare. So I'm gonna say that this is probably something that people can do for a less severe situation. I hope you don't end up in the hospital, but if you do, these are things that you could probably do in terms of like an aftercare. So not in a crisis situation, obviously, or critically acute situation, but hopefully even preventative or after the fact. If you have a mild flare, then you can definitely do these things. So a flare up is just that. It's basically you've had some trigger, whether it's a emotional trigger, a stressor, not getting enough sleep, travel, something like that, or it could be a toxin or something irritating that you've ingested. And simply it could be just food, eating the wrong food that is not working for you. But one of these things usually is what triggers a flare for people. Can sometimes be medications as well. But what happens is we get all inflamed, and then everything kind of goes nuts for a few days to a couple of weeks or longer in some cases. So most times you will visit your doctor, and your doctor will give you an anti-inflammatory, something like that. And hopefully you don't have a severe infection from your flare. In that case, it could get really bad because you could get septic. So if we're looking at, just dealing with a mildish kind of flare, then these are the steps that really did help me, and I noticed a significant difference in it, in the way that I felt, and the flare was over and done within a couple of days. First of all, first step is to fast, and what I mean by fasting is no solid foods. We're not fasting necessarily to find autophagy, definitely not fasting for weight loss. And your body detoxifies itself. So we really are just fasting at this point to give your digestive system a break. All of your intestinal lining is inflamed. And so when you're putting food through there constantly and your body's having to digest it, that just inflames it more. So giving your body a break is a really good way just to calm things down in there immediately. And so you can take in liquids, and you should take in liquids, but for a few days, taking a break from food. And so what I recommend is at least a 24-hour fast. Now, for me, I always do intermittent fasting. I think it's a good practice to help your body have a window of time every day just to kind of reset. And I've done that successfully. Many of my clients have done that successfully, no problems. But when we're inflamed and the level of inflammation is so heightened as it is in a flare, then you might need to go a little longer. And so 24 hours is usually kind of the beginnings of where things really do calm down. So you would definitely hydrate, get your salt in during that time, make sure your electrolytes are up. But that is one way to do it. And then going as long as you can, and I would say even 3 days would be a really good time to reset, as long as you're not too severely underweight, and you're getting some liquid nutrition, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Then you can do this safely. You definitely don't want to get dehydrated, but you can go without the calories in food for a couple days. You don't want to go too much longer than that. My probably most notable fast in terms of what made a difference for my gut was a 3-day fast. And it definitely made the difference in terms of my symptoms. I was going from bleeding and mucus and, all this nasty stuff to then that very, very minimal. And this was in the beginning of my carnivore journey. So it had already kind of slowed down a bit. So I think anywhere from 1 to 3 days is probably good. And you can repeat those occasionally. The reason why you don't want to go too much longer than that is because when you fast or calorie restrict too long, it really does slow down your thyroid, and your thyroid function is really important to keeping up your gut health and everything else in your body. It's what keeps the hormones balanced, your master gland. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of a healthy thyroid. And if you're trying to fix your gut health and your thyroid's a mess, it's never going to work. You're going to continue to have problems and come back to that all the time because of all of the other things that are associated with thyroid. And slow digestion is one of them. And then this opens you up to more problems with like endotoxins and just poor digestion. So fasting anywhere between 24 hours to 3 days is a great practice to deal with a flare. The other thing is a lot of rest. So I know that you hear this all the time, but there's a reason that our body needs to rest during a flare. Your cortisol levels are typically really heightened if you're in a flare, and you need those to come down as soon as you can. And so resting and working out and things like that, especially if you're fasting, is not a good idea. If you're dealing with any sort of injury, you heal your body by resting. It always heals when it's resting. So during a flare, you should take it easy. Take that time for yourself to hand off the to-do list to somebody else and take a few days off. That made a huge difference for me when I finally gave myself the rest and allowed myself to rest and heal during a flare. I bounced back much quicker. The third thing I would suggest during a flare would be to consume oxtail broth. And I talk about this in another video because sometimes people do get a histamine reaction when they cook these bones too long. And the same could happen for oxtail, but you typically only need to cook it like you would any other soup. Simmer it for a couple of hours, maybe 2 hours on the stove. And that's really all it takes. And it has a higher percentage of gelatin that comes from the oxtail rather than just the bones. It'll be far better than the bone broth itself. And most people seem to do better with it in regards to not having a histamine reaction. So the third is going to be consume some sort of broth that gives you the gelatin or the glycine that you need to help rebuild the tissue. That in and of itself, honestly, is probably one of the most important nutrients that you need to get in your body to help rebuild the lining of your tissue. So whether it's gelatin and the Jello format or broth, it doesn't really matter. It's more just that you're getting that gelatin or that glycine into your system. Because that is what's going to help your body with the connective tissue, plus all the other great benefits of collagen and gelatin. So those 3 steps are the biggest pieces: fasting, resting, and getting in your collagen or broth. I think those 3 steps are critical to getting through a flare quickly. Other things that you can do that I think are kind of helpful, but some people do well, some don't, is taking higher doses of probiotics. You could take some antiviral or antifungal herbs like olive leaf or oregano oil. Be careful with that. It's really strong. You got to take it with food. But those are some options too. And then my favorite that I learned when I was in Costa Rica, my favorite herb for inflammation in the intestines is actually curcumin. And interesting thing about curcumin is you find it in the stores in capsules and supplements, but it's always paired with black pepper because it's said to increase absorption. Well, the trick here is that you actually don't want it to get absorbed into the body. You want it to stay right in the intestines. And so taking your turmeric in its whole form, like juicing it, or the way that I was taught in Costa Rica, which is boiling it, and you can boil it with some ginger and lemon juice and make a Costa Rican cocktail. I posted that years ago. That actually works pretty good, and you can use a little stevia to sweeten it or honey or something like that, but it is strong. And just sipping on that is very good for killing bacteria that's in the colon, and also for bringing down the inflammation that is really driving this flare. So I hope you found those things helpful. I would love to hear from you if you've had any experience with any of these things during a flare or otherwise, or if you have some other ideas you'd like to share. So comment below and like this video if you found it helpful. Give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.